Welcome back to our video series on functions and groupings in Sigma. This video is part 2, where we will be using what we learned in the previous video about creating groupings and using functions, this time to perform more advanced calculations that interact with the groupings that we made last time. If you haven't already, make sure you check out the previous video first so you can follow along with the rest of this series more easily. Also, please keep in mind that the Plugs Electronics hands-on lab data is updated daily, so the numbers you see on screen may not necessarily match the ones on yours. Once you're set up with a nice set of groupings, you can finally use them to create some calculations. To start making calculations with groupings, we'll need to use some aggregate functions, which includes things like sum and count distinct. You can find a complete list of available aggregate functions in the function index. Aggregate functions are functions that use data from multiple rows of the target column to calculate a single value, or aggregate, for each group of the current grouping level. For example, this sum of revenue column is an aggregate of all the values for each order number in the group. Let's try making another aggregate now that we actually know what they are. Add a new column. We'll make this column the count of SKU number. Aggregate functions need to be used in a grouping and need to target some lower level column, like an ungrouped column here in the columns area, or a column in a lower level grouping. Let's try an example. Rename the sum of revenue column in the order number grouping to order revenue. Now we can create aggregates in higher grouping levels based on this order revenue column in a lower grouping level. We'll do sum of order revenue by store region. Rename that column regional revenue. Next, let's calculate the sum of regional revenue in the month of date grouping. Name that column monthly revenue. And we'll do the same thing one more time with yearly revenue. You can reference any lower level column as long as you use an appropriate aggregation function around that reference. Remember to check the aggregate functions list in the function index for suitable functions. If you write a reference to a lower level column, such as referencing month of date for a year of date grouping, without using an aggregate function at all, you will typically receive a multiple values error message. If you happen to be writing a formula and you see this message, it's probably a pretty good indication that you'll need to use an aggregate function. Let's try to use the aggregate function first to reference month of date. Now, we get a single value for the first month listed. Keep in mind that the result depends on how the column is sorted. However, there is actually one case where you can reference a lower level column without an aggregate function. You can do this if your target column has one distinct value for each group of your current grouping level. For example, this data source contains a set of order numbers, and each of these order numbers is associated with exactly one store state. Even across multiple rows, this is one distinct value. For that reason, we can create a reference to store state in the order number grouping without an aggregate function. Because you need to know that your target column has exactly one unique value for each group in the grouping level, you can only use this technique if you really do know your data well. But you may find this useful for moving lower level columns to higher levels without aggregating. Lastly, keep in mind that you can always write references to higher level columns since there's always only one value in each higher level grouping for each lower level group by definition. For example, we can reference this monthly revenue column here in this store region grouping just fine. This is particularly useful for putting together multi-step calculations based on different levels of aggregates. Now, this monthly revenue is the total revenue for this month, and these store region values within this month are the revenue for that store region in this month. This means we can calculate the revenue that each store region contributes to the monthly total as a percentage by just dividing the two. Let's find each region's contribution to the total monthly revenue as a percentage by calculating this column as regional revenue divided by monthly revenue. Now you may have noticed that all the calculations we've built so far with aggregations have worked by pulling multiple rows of some column into a single row of a higher level column. But what if we want to create calculations that work across multiple different rows of the same column? For that, we'll need to use window functions, which is going to be covered in part 3 of this video series. This now concludes part 2 of this video series. Thank you so much for watching. For more information or help with anything not covered in this video, visit help.sigmacomputing.com to read our documentation, tutorials, and guides. Until next time, take care and happy calculating.